Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're diving into action methods in therapy.
Yeah, action methods.
This should be really fascinating. A lot of you sent in these chapters from a book on action methods.
That's right.
Which is super cool because we're getting to see it in action with individuals, families, and groups.
Yeah.
And I think what's so interesting about this is it's going beyond the talking cure.
Right.
It's really saying, okay, we got to do some stuff.
Exactly. Exactly. And what really struck me, looking at all these different sources, is how many ways this can be applied. I mean,
Yeah.
you see it in family therapy, you see it in groups dealing with things like substance abuse.
Yeah.
You see it in creative ways. I mean, they're using art, music,
Yeah.
and even narrative approaches. So yeah, it really runs the gamut.
So I guess for those of you who might not be as familiar, what are action methods? What are we talking about here?
Well, I think it's fair to say that it's a way of going beyond just verbal discussion.
Yeah.
Right. So traditional talk therapy. And it's saying, okay, let's get hands-on experiential. Let's use things like play, drama, art, and movement to actually let people kind of explore their inner experiences and their relationships with each other,
Sure.
but in a more direct way.
Yeah. And so what we're going to try to figure out in this deep dive is how do those approaches
Right.
actually make a difference? How do they create insight? How do they lead to change?
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what? I think we've got some examples here that will really surprise people
I think so too.
with how powerful these techniques can be.
Okay. So the first thing we're going to jump into is action methods in family therapy.
Right.
One of the chapters talks about this idea of dynamic family play. And they're looking at it particularly with adoptive families who are dealing with things like grief, loss, and adjustment.
Right.
What's the fundamental idea there?
Well, this chapter really emphasizes that when families engage in this kind of spontaneous interactive play, it's not just goofing off. It's actually a way for the natural creativity in the family to kind of come out.
Right.
And for real bonding to happen. You'll see families kind of improvising together, enjoying each other, even working through little conflicts.
Yeah.
Within the play itself. And what's interesting is they point out that families under a lot of stress
Yeah.
really struggle to do
To
that.
be playful.
To be playful, to connect in that way. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? When things get tense, that seems to be one of the first things to go.
Yeah.
So how does the therapist actually use this in sessions?
Yeah.
Because the chapter mentions that they start off by just observing family play.
Right.
So what are they looking for in those initial observations?
Well, I think you could say the therapist is like a detective
Okay.
at this stage,
Oh.
really trying to piece together, how the content of the play, what the family is actually doing,
Yeah.
and the style of the play, how they're interacting, how that connects with some of the emotional and behavioral things that they're discussing in words as well.
Okay.
What's really the aim here is to try to understand the goals for therapy,
Okay.
both in the language of play and the language of words.
Mm-hmm.
And, a good therapist will often do things like reflect back on what they're seeing,
Right.
maybe summarize patterns that they're noticing,
All
and
right.
ask questions, just to try to get a clearer picture of, what are the issues here? What's
Yeah.
the history of this family?
So they're also using specific play-based tasks for evaluation.
Yeah.
They talk about follow the leader as an example.
Yeah.
How can a simple game like that reveal what's going on underneath the surface?
Well, follow the leader might seem really basic,
Right.
but it can actually tell you a lot about how intimate the family is, how well they handle disagreements, and even sometimes kind of some of the big emotional themes that they might not be able to put into words. And what you'll typically see in a family that's functioning pretty well is kind of this free-flowing back and forth,
Yeah.
maybe parents kind of accommodating younger children and just sort of leadership kind of easily shifting back and forth.
Sure.
But when there are power struggles
Yeah.
or unresolved conflict, a lot of times the game just falls apart.
Right.
The spontaneous fun kind of stops.
And that's when you see those interpersonal problems
Exactly.
come to the surface.
Yeah, and in a way, you're seeing kind of a microcosm of the family dynamic.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. They also give this really striking example of an 8-year-old boy who drew slash marks over his mother's picture
Yeah.
after his friend had died. I mean, that's pretty intense.
It is, and it really kind of shows us something, right? Which is that Play can be, especially for kids who may not have all the words yet to explain what's going on inside,
Yeah.
it can be a really direct way to express deep and even painful stuff.
Yeah.
And in this case, the therapist really understood that.
Hmm.
That's what this drawing was about. And it helped both the boy and his mom make the connection between, what seemed like oppositional behavior
Yeah.
and his grief,
Oh, boy.
over losing his friend. So they were able to actually address both of those things through interactive play.
So it's kind of like that saying, sometimes actions speak louder than words.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Really.
They also talk about this interesting technique called the telling ball scarf game that they use with children who tend to withdraw.
Right.
How does bringing in a prop like that help open up communication about some of these hard things?
Well, it's interesting. The therapist will take a ball or a scarf
Yeah.
and actually label it as telling.
Okay.
And the parent will then try to, gently toss it to the child
Yeah.
while asking questions, personal questions. And the rule is if they get touched by the prop, they have to answer the question.
Got it.
And of course, kids who are, withdrawing or trying to avoid talking about feelings often become masters at dodging.
Right.
But what's interesting is that the therapist then helps the parent and the child to actually see the game itself as a metaphor
Okay.
for their mutual kind of holding back
Right.
emotionally.
Right.
And they use that to understand and start to maybe shift that pattern.
So the prop almost gives a little bit of distance
It does.
and permission to engage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not so direct.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So it's not all just about observing, though.
Right.
The therapist also steps in to guide families during play, especially when things start to get conflicted.
Yeah.
What does that coaching look like? What are they actually doing?
Well, sometimes it can be pretty directive. Families that are in conflict, sometimes they just don't know how to play in a healthy way anymore. So the therapist will kind of become a participant observer.
Right.
Sometimes they might model good ways to play.
Yeah.
They might suggest different variations on what the family is doing.
Okay.
And always they're helping to label the emotions that are coming up.
Okay.
To say, oh, it seems like you're getting frustrated.
Right.
Or it looks like you're feeling sad.
And to connect what they're seeing in the playroom
Yeah.
to what happens at home.
Exactly. To make those links.
Yeah. Yeah. They talk about this divorced father and his sullen son playing telling scarf. And the son's response was to completely hide with pillows.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about,
Yeah.
being emotionally unavailable.
Yeah, that really just showed, how much difficulty they were having
Yeah.
connecting emotionally, expressing how they felt. And, you have this game that's designed to actually open up communication.
Yeah.
And it completely breaks down.
Right.
And that really just speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And then there's this case with Brian and Brandy, who are the kids in this adoptive family.
Right.
And their parents.
Yeah.
And they're first trying to play at a park through drawing.
Yeah.
And that kind of falls apart.
Yeah.
And then they try to create a story with pillows and stuffed animals.
Right. Yeah.
And there are all these complex dynamics that start to come up there.
There really are. Like Brandy's immediately wanting to be under the pillows in her home.
Right.
And Brian burying puppets.
Yeah.
That represented a brother. It just suggested all these issues about security and belonging.
Right.
And maybe even some past trauma there that they were carrying with them.
And even that first attempt with the drawing, I mean, it just dissolved into conflict so quickly.
Yeah.
It seemed like whatever was going on inside of them just sort of spilled right out
Yeah.
onto this shared task.
Yeah, you're right.
And the therapist then tries to help them design a game that represents their problems at home.
Right.
And she even uses this pillow wall to divide the play space.
Right.
It's almost like a very concrete way of externalizing their conflict.
Exactly. By creating a physical representation of what was happening,
Right.
the therapist gave them a way to actually act out their arguments.
Right.
And the tensions that were happening at home.
Right.
And they had this big emotional breakdown. Both kids were crying.
Right.
Mrs. Gray felt overwhelmed.
Right.
Brian was yelling about how he wanted Brandy to leave and his sister to come back.
Yeah.
Really raw stuff.
Right. Right. And that led to this disclosure of Brandy's history of abuse.
Right.
Which, is a huge deal. How did the metaphors that came up in their play, how did that connect with that disclosure?
Well, it helped the parents to understand a lot of Brandy's behaviors,
Right.
that need for that safe home under the pillows,
Right.
her resistance to joining in with the others. It was
Yeah.
all connected to her trauma, and her difficulty trusting.
It also gave them some insight into, how their own grief
Right.
was maybe playing a role in their difficulty bonding with Brandy.
Yeah, that ongoing grief
Right.
over their daughter. So, for the first time, they could see how that history of loss was impacting their present.
And it seemed like that was a catalyst for Mr. Gray to get more involved.
It really was. It was a turning point.
So that's a great example of how, play can sometimes get past
Yeah.
some of those defenses
Absolutely.
and allow things to come out that, just asking might not get to.
Right.
And the source then moves into talking about psychodramatic methods.
Right.
Specifically, John Binghall's approach to revising family stories.
Right.
How does actually acting things out help in rewriting those narratives?
Well, Bing Hall really believed in using the power of dramatic enactment
Okay.
to let families literally rewrite their scripts, by actually changing their interactions
Okay.
right there in the room. It's not just talking about the past or the future. It's like creating a new experience in the present
Right.
that can actually change those deep patterns.
Right. Like rehearsing a new way to be.
Exactly.
And psychodrama uses these techniques like role training.
Right.
What's the idea there?
Well, role training is really about getting individuals to kind of explore and maybe stretch the roles
Okay.
they play in the family.
So it's like trying on different hats.
Yeah, trying on different ways to understand things, see things from each other's point of view, interact.
Okay.
And it can involve practicing new behaviors,
That's good.
in the safety of the therapy room.
Sure.
So they can do it in real life.
Right.
Bing Hall was really trying to strengthen that feeling of family security and collaboration
Okay.
by helping families discover and try out new ways to solve problems.
Yeah. Makes sense. You highlight this case with Nicholas, who took on the role of sadness after his grandmother's death.
Right.
That seems like a very direct way to engage with grief.
It was. And, by becoming sadness, Nicholas literally acted out
Yeah.
how it was taking over the family. He was pushing his mom away,
Yeah.
isolating his dad. He even pummeled a stuffed animal that represented himself.
It's almost like they gave it a body.
Yeah. They gave it a body.
That grief.
Right. And it made it much more real.
Right. Not so abstract.
Exactly.
And then there's this technique, role reversal, where he actually experiences what it's like to be on the receiving end of sadness.
Right.
What kind of insight did that give?
Well, role reversal is so powerful for building empathy.
Yeah.
Because by actually experiencing what it felt like to be controlled and pummeled by that sadness,
Yeah.
Nicholas got a much deeper understanding of
Yeah.
how it was affecting him and the family.
Right.
And they all said they felt this sense of isolation and helplessness,
Okay.
like they couldn't help each other.
Right. And then there's this technique behind the back where less stayed in the role of sadness,
Right.
more
Right.
so that his family could talk about their feelings toward him
Right.
without feeling like they were attacking him directly.
Yeah.
What a clever way to kind of get around
It was brilliant.
our natural defensiveness.
Yeah, because by keeping less in the role, the family could be more honest
Right.
about how it was impacting them.
Yeah.
He didn't have to defend himself.
And it created this sense of unity
Yeah.
of we're all in this together against this thing.
Exactly. And that's what they did. They started to defend him
Right.
against this outsider, this sadness.
It's fascinating how these enactments really help them to see their roles
Yeah.
and their interactions as something that was changeable.
Right.
Right? Sadness went from this dominant force to something that they could actually push back against.
Yeah. That's a really important shift, isn't it?
It is. It is. And it sounds like, even those initial little scenes they did, the vignettes, they provided a lot of information
Absolutely.
about how isolated they were feeling in their grief.
You'd see it.
Yeah.
Right. And then you could also see the shift toward collaboration
Right.
when Les started questioning, this idea that they were going to fall apart.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing how psychodrama really can
Yeah.
make the covert overt, as
Yeah,
they say.
right.
Visible.
Bring it to light.
And that shared experience,
Yeah.
that embodied experience,
Yeah.
it leads to empathy. It
Yeah.
leads to understanding.
Totally. I like how the therapist then took it even further. and sort of externalized sadness
But even more.
by telling Nicholas to kind of be on the lookout for it
Yeah.
at home
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
even question it when it shows up. It's like empowering them to take action.
Exactly. You're not just sitting there passively.
Right. Right. And then Marla's enacted scene of a positive gathering
Yeah.
with, her parents being supportive.
And then that mirroring technique
Yeah.
that they used after.
Yeah.
How did that reveal her desires, her needs?
Well, mirroring is really just having her watch her own scene
Right.
and then reflect on it with the therapist.
Right.
And what came out was that she really wanted her mom to have a break
Okay.
from caregiving
Right.
and for her dad to help with Nicholas more.
Right.
So, it kind of showed the difference between like her ideal family and how it really was.
Right. Right. So what we're seeing in this section is that this dramatic enactment
Yeah.
can create real change.
Right.
You're not just talking about it, you're experiencing something new.
Exactly. And the other thing they point out, which is really interesting, is that because the focus is on the action,
Yeah.
there's less chance of the family kind of projecting their stuff onto the therapist.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. So they're more in charge of the process.
Right, because it's coming from them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So let's switch gears now and talk about action methods in group therapy.
Okay.
The first area that you highlighted is the work of Daniel J. Wiener and his Rehearsals for Growth,
Right.
or RFG, with groups for folks dealing with substance abuse.
Right.
This seems like a really innovative approach using improvisational theater.
It is. It really is. And Wiener was very creative,
Yeah.
He took some of those core techniques from improv and adapted them
Okay.
to create RFG. And the idea was to give people in recovery the skills they needed to stay sober.
Okay.
And what they emphasize is building trust in the group,
Right.
fostering that interdependence between members,
Yeah.
and really boosting people's confidence in their own spontaneity and creativity.
Yeah.
Because now they have to navigate life without substances.
Right, right. And you're talking about the typical client entering this outpatient program as being post-detox.
Yeah.
Give us a sense of the program, like how long it is, what the completion rates are like.
Sure. So they actually join the program right after detox,
Okay.
and they can enter on any day that the program is running.
Got it.
And they graduate after 18 consecutive program days.
Okay.
And they have a pretty good completion rate, actually, around 72%.
Wow, that's not bad.
No, although about 2/3 of the people who leave in that first week.
Oh, really?
Yeah, often over the weekend.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And at any given time, they usually have about 6 to 20 clients
Okay.
actively participating.
So these RFG groups are integrated with talk therapy and family support.
Right.
How often are clients actually attending these RFG sessions?
Well, typically, clients will participate in 4 to 6 of these 1-hour RFG group sessions every week.
Okay.
And that's in addition to, more of the standard talk therapy sessions.
Okay.
And weekly individual therapy appointments.
Got it.
And then there's also a weekly family support group.
Okay.
And if they request it, they can have couples or more intensive family therapy.
Right. What's also interesting is that about half of the clients actually go to an aftercare group
Oh, wow.
once they've finished the program.
That's great.
Yeah.
So the stated goals are not only to increase those completion rates,
Right.
but also to give people, essential social skills
Right.
and broaden the range of their emotional expression.
Right.
And it's open-ended,
Yeah.
right? So you have this mix of new and returning members.
Right.
How does that work in practice?
Well, it's interesting because you've got these veteran members.
Yeah.
And then you've got the newcomers.
Right.
And that actually creates a very supportive atmosphere.
Right.
Because the veterans are, they're role models.
Yeah.
They can demonstrate the coping skills.
Right.
They can offer encouragement to the new people.
Totally.
And because it's open-ended, you're always getting these fresh perspectives.
Right.
You know?
It's not stale.
Exactly.
Yes, Garrett.
So they're using the internal family systems therapy, IFS, as a guiding framework.
Right.
For people who are not familiar with that, can you explain a little bit about how this idea of parts of us and self-leadership applies in this context?
Sure. So The IFS model, what it says is that our personality
Yeah.
isn't just one thing.
Right.
It's a system.
Right.
It's made up of these different parts or subpersonalities.
Wow.
And these parts can, they can hold different memories, emotions,
Right.
even burdens from our past.
Right.
And so the aim of IFS is to get all these parts working together
Right.
harmoniously
Okay.
under the guidance of this thing called the self, capital S.
Okay.
And the self is kind of like the core of wisdom, compassion, and confidence that,
Okay.
we believe exists inside every person.
Okay.
And in the RFG groups, what they do is they use the language of IFS to help people start separating
Okay.
their substance abusing part
Right.
from their whole self.
Right.
And it helps them to see and access
The good qualities of their other parts.
Right.
And to connect with that core self
Yeah.
as a source of strength and recovery.
Right. So it's not like you're an addict. It's like a part of you struggles with this.
Exactly. It's just a part.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And they give these two great examples of Jared, who presented with this tough guy image
Right.
and was court mandated.
Right.
And then Bob, who really struggled with feeling devalued
Yeah.
and wanted to please everybody.
Right.
It just shows like the range, right?
It does. And you see how Jared's toughness,
Yeah.
it's a mask.
Right.
It's hiding these vulnerabilities
Right.
that are really common for people with addiction.
Sure.
And then Bob's, his history of being ridiculed, his need to please,
Yeah.
it shows how different kinds of hurts
Yeah.
can lead to these issues.
Yeah. It's a reminder that addiction doesn't discriminate.
It doesn't. It
Yeah.
really doesn't.
Right.
Right. So then they talk about this mirrors exercise, which is where partners silently mirror each other's movements.
Right.
And they give this example of Mary and Barbara
Right.
and how positive that experience was.
Right.
And how that kind of peer modeling
Yeah.
can help break down some of those emotional barriers.
It can. And mirrors is really powerful for nonverbal connection
Yeah.
and acceptance. And because Mary had done it before,
Right.
she was able to reassure Barbara, which
Sure.
really helped, because when you see someone else doing it,
Yeah.
you're more likely to be like, oh, okay.
Right. Right. I can do that too.
Right.
And then there's the example of Bob expressing his fear of ridicule,
Yeah.
which Mary then echoes,
Right.
and the group applauds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That really shows the importance
It does.
of creating that safe and accepting environment.
It's essential. And Bob and Mary being so vulnerable
Yeah.
in sharing those fears and experiences.
And the group responding with empathy and support,
Right.
it reinforces the idea that it's okay to be imperfect.
Right.
Right.
Right. It's okay to put yourself out there.
Exactly. And
Right.
to be seen.
Yeah. And they really